So let's have a look at something that happened this morning on the AM show. It was interesting. The leader of the opposition was interviewed about the $20 million that New Zealand has just committed to COP27 to help developing countries offset the negative effects from carbon emissions and from climate change. And Ryan Bridge kind of set up the start of the show. It sounded to me like he was going, "Oh, what do you think of this, Mr. Luxon?" And Mr. Luxon kind of went, "Yeah, it's always good to support the countries who need support." And he talked about climate issues and that, and it was almost a bit like Ryan Bridge was expecting a different response of like, "Well, waste of money, $20 million. Well, that's right." But actually, to his credit, Mr. Luxon basically was like, we've got to do something about climate change, and this is something. That was sort of the response. The second part of the interview got into a conversation that we were having last night, George, where he spoke to Mr. Luxon, and Chewy, you weren't here for this, so you can jump onto this. He spoke to Mr. Luxon about the Reed Research poll from yesterday that you did the word cloud, and he asked he asked him about his word cloud. So let's pick it up from there, and then we'll have a chat about a second part of the conversation as well, because apparently Mr. Luxon is not very pro-business.
Right, News Hub Read Research, they did a word association thing with voters and asked them what they thought of you. I'm going to show our viewers a little glimpse at the moment of some of the words that people use to describe you. Don't know, unknown, average, inexperienced, unsure, smarmy.
Now, the first thing I want to point out as we're doing this is just note that what Ryan Bridge is doing is the correct thing, because what these word clouds are is they take all these words, and the more times it's referenced, the bigger the word. So he's saying don't know, which is the biggest, unknown, which is the second biggest, inexperienced, which is big, smarmy, which is big, average. So he's using and pulling out all the words from the word cloud that most people, i.e. I could extrapolate most New Zealanders think about when they think about Christopher Luxon. Yeah. So that's a pretty fair response from Ryan Bridge, pointing out, like, if this was a pie chart, he's pointing out the biggest chunks of the pie when he's talking to Mr. Luxon about Mr. Luxon's words. Okay, we'll keep going.
Arrogant was another one. Do you relate to any of those, Chris?
No, I don't actually. But I mean, what I'd say is, look, I mean, the way I've come through politics has been really fast to become the leader of the National Party. And, that's a big, thing that people need to get to know me. They're going to do that over the course of the year. It's going to be a big, long job interview, and they'll get a sense of what I'm about. What I'd say is that I come with real world, leadership experience. I come not as a career politician. I will be different. And I think that's a really good thing and what's needed in New Zealand right now.
What do you make?
So good to hear that he's talking about his real world experience. So he's putting out his business credentials, which is what he's running on, which is fine. So he's saying, I'm a businessman, I've run businesses, I'm good with running businesses. Yeah Okay. So let's listen to this next part. Ryan Bridge goes into the conversation talking about the words used for Jacinda Ardern.
Think of some of the words that the public used to describe your opponent and the Prime Minister. Some of the worst ones were evil, liar, useless, deceitful, dictator.
Okay.
Jesus.
So they're the words for the Prime Minister. And as we've just seen evidence by Mr. Luxon's word cloud, he used all the biggest parts of the pie. So you would expect, fair be fair, what are all the biggest words of the pie for Jacinda Ardern? Notice they didn't put up Jacinda Ardern's word cloud. I don't know if you noticed that, but they didn't put it up. So we'll put it up. Here's her word cloud. And they did say the word useless, and that's one of the larger words. Funny they didn't use the word caring, good, kind, capable, great, or empathetic. But they did say evil, liar, deceitful, dictator. Can you see those, Chewy? Can you see those words?
I can't. Do I need glasses or an
Shall I help?
or something?
Shall I help?
Oh,
I'll help.
Really?
There they are.
Oh, Jesus.
There's those words. So, the big chunk of the pie that thinks those words, it's just, I'm watching this interview and thinking, oh yeah, because I did a piece the other night basically saying that Ryan Bridge can't hide his disdain for the Prime Minister or Labour anymore. So
I saw that interview the other day. It was disgraceful.
Ryan Bridge chose to highlight, they didn't show the word cloud for the Prime Minister, but he chose to highlight the words dictator, which I can't even read and I'm here, liar, deceitful, evil, and useless. Didn't mention the big words. Mentioned the big words for Mr. Luxon. Didn't mention the big words for the Prime Minister. But That's what he did, and that's what he went with. So he asked Mr. Luxon about the words that he's just mentioned: evil, liar, deceitful, dictator, and useless. And to be honest, to his credit, Mr. Luxon had a fairly bland response. He didn't really attack the words, but he did use it as a point to put out his talking points.
Well, look, I think Jacinda Ardern, has good intentions. I think the key issue that we've found with her and her government is, it is comprised of all career politicians. They haven't necessarily run things or know how to get things done. I think that's the real challenge that they're running into now. Essentially, New Zealanders are looking at it and saying, look, there's a lot of spin, but there's no delivery. The economy's going backwards. Our healthcare system's falling apart. Our kids aren't going to school. We've got major challenges with housing crisis. We've got rising levels of crime. Those are the outcomes that New Zealanders want to see governments improve for them. So that's how they get ahead.
There you go, Chewy. So you've seen the word cloud conversation with us. And I just want to point out one more thing before you jump in, or either of you jump in with comments on the first part of this Mr. Luxon conversation, is one of the things that Christopher Luxon is doing is running on his business record, right? He said there the problem with Labour is, quote, they haven't run things, i.e. they haven't run businesses. They're not business people. The reason I'm highlighting that is we're about to get to a part of this conversation where all of a sudden, maybe because it doesn't fit the popular narrative, Mr. Luxon's going to become very unbusiness, but we'll get to that in a minute. Chewy, what do you think of the word cloud and the response that you've got from there?
I both love and hate those word clouds because it's generally very funny, and then the other part of it is it's borderline bullying, especially for someone like Luxon. Yeah, I mean, he's going, I've come into politics fast, and that's why don't know is so big. It's because he's just not on people's radar. Like, he can't come in and say that he's come up through the business world because he's just been a middle management. He hasn't run anything. Even his tenure, the closest thing he had for running something was Air New Zealand, and that apparently was not a good time for the company. All he had to do was stop it failing, and that was just by the skin of his teeth. So yeah, I don't know, if you're going to be business daddy, be a good business daddy.
Yeah. Anything about that for today, George? It's kind of flying on from our conversation last night, but I did start to feel again, yep, here we go. This is your AM show conversation where basically they enable and help the right win talking points because we're going to give Ryan Bridge, and as we say, because we can walk and chew gum, we're going to give him some credit very shortly. But that's how the start of the conversation certainly felt.
I'm surprised he didn't bring up the white thing. I felt like that. In a
Did you see that, Joey? One of the words was white for
which I feel like is basically a cross between unknown / don't know and more of the same, right? Is basically what's encapsulated in that word white.
There's bald.
Oh, actually, no, someone pointed this out to me.
Like
there's another bald.
There's two. Oh yeah, there is up here. There's two of them. There's a bald there as well. He's bald. He's double bald. Where does it say? The problem is trying to find things like, there's white. They say white's pretty big. That means actually quite a few people responded by saying white. And it's like, why? I mean, like, why would acknowledging one's Caucasianness be of importance unless for that person it was of importance?
Yeah. I guess that's what I was trying to explain. Is to people, it signifies a more of the same, and a / don't know, right? It's just like, he's a white dude.
Yeah.
Same as businessman, I guess. It's a signifier of someone in power.
Well, what a great segue, George. Speaking of businessman, to his credit, 100% credit where credit's due. Ryan Bridge started a really interesting line of conversation with Mr. Luxon after that, talking about bank profits. Because I don't know about people out there, if you run a business, the idea of running a business primarily is to turn a profit. There can be altruistic businesses that also provide, good for community and good for society. And that's always, in my opinion, the best kinds. But at its absolute core, the idea of a business is it needs to make a profit to continue on as a business. So profit making is quite an important component of business ownership and running a business. So again, to his credit, Ryan Bridge asked Mr. Luxon about the bank profits, especially when Mr. Luxon has come out this week, basically agreeing with the Prime Minister that these bank profits are too much. But hang on, you'll say, National is the party of business. They are the party of successful businesses. Surely huge amounts of profits would basically identify a successful business. How do those two things marry up? Let us have a look.
You have basically this week agreed with the Prime Minister. I've looked at your wording and the wording of your deputy. You basically agree that they're making unjustifiable profits in a cost of living crisis, right?
Well, what we're saying is, look, at a time where there is a massive cost of living crisis, where Kiwis are doing it incredibly tough with rising inflation, rising interest rates, and at the same time you've got large bank profits. That's a really tough thing to see.
But what's large bank profits? And why are you the arbiter of large bank profits?
Well, no, what I'm saying is, what we've been requesting the government to do is, it's all very well to talk about large bank profits, but they need to do something about that. And the thing that they need to do is actually get to the cause of the problem, which is what we've been calling for, an independent inquiry on the actions of the Reserve Bank and the government around its spending, around the printing of money, around the borrowing of money through
but
COVID,
are their profits
and
not
to understand whether that contributed to bank profits,
fine, we can talk
as well
about,
as contributed to worsening the cost of living crisis.
We can talk about.
But just remember as well on this point, it's been pointed out very clearly that tax cuts that National are proposing are going to contribute to inflation, at least the same as current spending by the government, if not more. So we always got to remember that.
What contributes to it, but aren't large bank profits a byproduct of the fact that they are large banks?
Well, they are. They're large businesses. They've got large asset bases. They need to have good levels of profitability. It's important. Why? Because as we look out for the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to go through some very, very tough economic times.
So are you
we need our banks to be profitable and strong.
Right. So are you uncomfortable with the profits, or are you not uncomfortable with the profits?
I am uncomfortable. What I'm wanting to understand is, I want a proper understanding of whether the New Zealand government's actions actually enlarge those profits.
What gives you
more
cause?
than they would have been, and because of government printing.
Okay, but why are you concerned about the profits? What exactly about the profits? Is it because it's more than $1 billion? Is it because it's 13% as a return on equity, which, by the way, is middle of the road for NZX listed companies? What exactly are you uncomfortable about?
Well, what I'm really uncomfortable about is the actions of.
Is this interview? I didn't think I'd be asked these questions. Maybe it might be the answer there.
You're my puppy. You're not supposed to bite me.
Yeah, like we've always said this. We are ardently and honestly about where we approach from. But if something else requires or deserves praise, we will give it praise. And this is a really good line of questioning.
Spending $1 billion.
No. Sorry.
Each and every week.
No. You said you were uncomfortable with the banking profits. Chris, you said you're uncomfortable with the banking profits, and that's what I'm asking you about.
Yeah, so what?
Can I ask a little byproduct there? He called him Chris.
Yeah, I was just thinking that.
Like they're good mates.
He always does.
But he never calls the Prime Minister Jacinda, does he? Does that demonstrate an over-familiarity? Look, I'm not criticising him on his line of questioning, but I think it's interesting he called him Chris. I don't think I've ever heard him call her Jacinda, and I don't think it would be appropriate other than Prime Minister.
I've also seen Luxon push back on being called Chris, like in interviews and that sort of thing, that he prefers to be called Christopher.
I'm also thinking leader or Mr. Luxon. Chris is very familiar. I'm not saying it's necessarily bad. I mean, we'd call him Chris because that's our style. But I just had the thought, leader of the opposition is like Chris, like a mate would talk, whereas the Prime Minister, it's Prime Minister, Prime Minister.
He's just like, he can't.
All right, let's play the end of this. Only a few seconds to go because this is coming up to the salient point that Ryan Bridge makes very well.
What I'm saying to you is, I want to understand how those bank profits are derived, and actually whether they benefited from government action around government spending, but also Reserve Bank printing of money. We've been calling for an independent inquiry because we want to understand that for two reasons. One is about the reappointment of a Reserve Bank governor, to understand the performance of the Reserve Bank, but also to understand whether the government's actions actually contributed to rising levels of cost of living, inflation, interest rates, and bank profits.
Are you uncomfortable with the nearly $500 million profit you turned as Chief of Air New Zealand?
Oh,
No, I'm very proud of the record of Air New Zealand
So
around
what's the
commercial
difference?
success, cultural success, and customer success.
What's the
But
difference?
it's about just making sure that we understand whether the government's actions actually contributed to worsening the cost of living and inflating government bank profits.
And that's
What?
it. I mean,
So
if I was going to critique it, I'd say this is the next point of this conversation. He just goes,
All right. Chris Luxon, thank you very much for your time this morning.
so we got to the best part of the conversation, a really, really, really good pushback, and only got one kind of pushback, but it was a pushback, and I think it was a really, and this is the point, for me, and I've said this many times, and I would say this to Dunedin mayoralty candidates when they come in touting their business acumen. I'm like, Dunedin City Council is not a fucking business. You can't run it like a business. The government is not a business. Yeah, look, I'm not criticizing you for being a good businessman or a businessman. I'm not saying Mr. Luxon, but in general. But it's not necessarily the be all and end all for becoming the leader of the country, because you cannot run a country like a business. Because if you ran a country like a business, for example, all the libraries would be shut down because they're not profitable. You know what I'm saying? It's like, it's not a business. It's basically more like, have you ever run a not-for-profit? That would probably be a better, like transferable sort of skill set than a for-profit business. But anyway, George, you were about to say something.
No, Luxon basically at the end, because of the pushing that's happening, he has to basically try and turn it around, say basically the problem isn't the bank profits. The problem is we have to make sure if the government did something to make that happen, right? And from a traditional national view or a pro-business view or whatever, then the government doing something to make that happen would be a good thing, as you're sort of getting at, Pat. But he sort of, I guess, is able to worm his way out of that and make it become about, if the government has contributed to this.
Yeah.
The other thing is, I think the whole banks thing recently, I mean, it's sort of the classic lie of neoliberalism that somehow all these businesses that purely there to turn profit and reproduce will somehow take up social responsibility because norms, etc. And that's sort of the great lie that's not really always interrogated in these conversations. But the point I wanted to make there is it is interesting how the banks have been in the headlines for the week. It sort of is able to move attention away from cost of living as a Jacinda Ardern problem and cost of living as correctly as a more structural problem.
Well, it's like everything in our lives that contributes to cost of living at the moment. We talk about the supermarkets, we talk about the fuel companies, now we talk about the banks with everybody's money and everybody's mortgages and that sort of thing. And everybody's going, New Zealanders are doing it tough. But they aren't. They're all posting record profits. And especially from the banks to go from 1 week going, well, we've got to take some heat out of this economy. We probably need 150,000 people to lose their jobs and absolutely get, toughed out on the area. And then we'll be sweet. And then the very next week, profit after profit after profit. And it's like, oh, you bastards. That was my reaction to every one of those stories. You absolute bastards. Because when they're talking about these people losing their jobs to cool off the economy, they're real people.
Yeah.
They've got bills to pay,
yeah.
kids to feed. It's just that disconnect at the moment is just, I can't get there.
The thing that Ryan Bridge did well then, is that it's fairly obvious that he's basically calling Christopher Luxon on making a populist stand and not a stand he believes in. It's the classic politician thing where you say something because it scores well with society. Because that whole point, hang on, how come you at Air New Zealand were allowed to make $500 million profit, but the bank's making $1 billion profit is wrong. Why? Where that seems incongruent to me. And so the reason that Christopher Luxon is saying this is not good is because Labor's saying this is not good, and because the people are agreeing that it's not good, so he has to say it's not good. And then thankfully someone, I'm hand on heart and apologies to him, but I'm surprised that it was Ryan Bridge, someone has to actually go, hang on, this doesn't make sense, because you are a businessman, you are for profit, you would be the more profit the better the business. How can you be against this? So credit where credit's due, walk and chew gum. Well done, Ryan Bridge.